Hey guys, Budcat7 here. Okay, it is Saturday, March 16, 2019, and I want to thank you for visiting the Stonewall Research channel here on YouTube. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And today for you, I got a video. Basically, I continue to go over Charles C. Mann's book, 1491. New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, just because it's just a fascinating book and it has all sort of new revelations in anthropology and archaeology that deals with the Americas. And it doesn't really comport with the mainstream stuff that we all learned, when we went to our state-approved brainwashing clinics. So, Mann is not an archaeologist or anthropologist. He's a writer. Sort of like C.W. Ceram was a writer. Even though there's an archaeological award, Ceram Award, given to archaeologists, Ceram wasn't an archaeologist. He just wrote about archaeology, okay? He was not a professional, and neither is Mann, okay? And they write, best-selling and literary prize-winning books, etc., and they're not professional academics in any of these fields, okay? So I guess it's okay not to be a professional academic in any of these fields and, have some very compelling things to say about it. Okay, guys, well, again, we continue to go through this book, and, as I do, I relate, whatever I'm reading, to my own research, etc., and, discussions I have with other researchers and people who are into the stone walls of New York and New England and all the other stone works in, this area of the world. And, folks, us in the alternative, view of these things, just understand that, this is like the largest area, of a singular system, in any case, of the world of man-made stoneworks. I mean, the overall area and the amount of stonework in the northeastern United States is just unbelievable, just more than anything on the face of the planet. So, I mean, and you can hear Barbara DeLong, in her film Secrets of the Stones, says that as well. And she believes that there's probably more like, 500,000 miles of stone walls in New England, and not the 240 as reported by the U.S. Department of Agriculture Land Survey in 1872. And you got to think about it. Nobody got out there with a tape measure and measured all these walls, guys. That's an estimate. Okay? That was an estimate on their part. Nobody, they'd still be doing it today if they were doing it with tape measures, Now they do it with LiDAR if they wanted to. And I don't know if they're ever gonna. Maybe they will. Or somebody will. Alright, so let me read to you. I've been skipping around from these chapters, and I just want to read to you some of this stuff from Charles C. Mann's book, 1491, New Revelation of the Americas Before Columbus. Okay, so this is the second chapter, Why Billington Survived. And Billington is actually Mann's ancestor from the Mayflower. He's like a bad guy, troublemaker, or whatever. And he writes about him and relates, the story of Massasoit and, other Indian figures from, this particular story is about that early time of the colonists and, native people's relationship and all the things that went wrong, and what was actually going on. But I just will read a little bit to you from this chapter, some snippets here and there. We'll talk about it a little bit. Okay, so on March 22nd, 1621, an official Native American delegation walked through what is now southern New England to negotiate with the group of foreigners who had taken over a recently deserted Indian settlement. So, just to show you that, the colonists and settlers had no problem taking over a recently deserted Indian settlement. Probably a lot of the reason behind that too is because just adjacent to these Indian settlements were these arable places of land where they were growing maize. Okay, the Native Americans is known by anthropologists and archaeologists here in the Northeast. Just know that all the Native peoples here in the Northeast were farmers, were heavily into agriculture, and even up to the point of being horticulturalists. So that's what we're talking about. And had Jimmy and I had talked about this, that most likely all the arable places where you could grow things had already been cleared by the native peoples already. Okay, so all this stuff about the toiling and moving the stones and all this kind of stuff may be just an egregious error of judgment by anybody who's even tackled this. And who is that? Robert Thorson is the expert. He's a geologist who happens to live near stone walls. And same with John Delano from SUNY Albany. They just happen to live in neighborhoods with stone walls, so now they're experts, okay? They did a little investigation. I gave Thorson credit for what he did. It's just his premise is wrong. Okay, at the head of the party was an uneasy triumvirate. Massasoit, the sachem, political military leader of the Wampanoag Confederation, a loose coalition of several dozen villages that control most of southeastern Massachusetts. Samoset, sachem of an allied group to the north, and Tisquantum, a distrusted captive who Massasoit had reluctantly brought along as an interpreter. Massasoit was an adroit politician, but the dilemma he faced would have tested Machiavelli. About 5 years before, most of his subjects had fallen before a terrible calamity. Whole villages had been depopulated. Indeed, the foreigners ahead now occupied one of the empty sites. So these people were all killed off by disease, mostly. But there was tremendous amount of violence against the native peoples here. I read it in all the histories of Long Island here, in Northport, in the areas where I'm at, and all those histories show that they were just simply wiping out any of the native peoples who refused to cooperate in any way. And I read to you about Jefferson coming up here to record, the languages here of certain tribes, and he could only find like 3 members, and they barely knew the language. Okay, by 1791. So it had already been all screwed up by then already. It was all he could do to hold together the remnants of his people. Adding to his problems, the disaster had not touched the Wampanoag's longtime enemies, the Narragansett alliance to the west. Soon Massasoit feared that they would take advantage of the Wampanoag's weakness and overrun them. Desperate threats required desperate countermeasures. In a gamble, Massasoit intended to abandon, even reverse, a long-standing policy. Europeans have been visiting New England for at least a century, shorter than the natives, oddly dressed and often unbearably dirty. The pallid foreigners have peculiar blue eyes that peeped out of masks of bristly animal-like hair that encased their faces. They were irritatingly garrulous, prone to fits of chicanery, and often surprisingly incompetent at what seemed to the Indians like basic tasks. For example, farming. Okay? Many of these people who were indentured servants were just indentured servants. Okay? That was just for the price of a ticket to get across the sea, to come to the Americas. That's it. And, you know, you had no knowledge of anything, you know, and you were going to attempt to be a farmer there. And they learned a tremendous amount from these people, the native peoples, who were just expert farmers. And all the arable land that could have been farmed by these farming peoples, whose numbers were underestimated, as we went over in the last video I did, okay, and on the anthropogenic forest, okay. So there was a lot more people here, okay, and they were growing stuff, and all those fields were cleared already in the mountainous areas where it's possible to grow something, or rather, or what, you know, in the best face of the mountain, because you can't grow it behind the mountain where the sun's not going to be. So not all mountain growing is good. Only some of it is good, okay, and where they could be grown, it had all been cleared already of the largest stones, okay? And that's why you don't find a lot of the field stone in some of these walls, like up by Jimmy, for example, okay? Because that's, you know, that was what the colonists and settlers were doing. They were pulling all this field stone out because it wasn't necessary for them to grow their crops. The Indians, they weren't that thorough, okay? And they built the walls, their ancestors, whomever they were, out of these large rocks that they pulled out of there, these large stones. And that type of agriculture was going on since then. The whole idea that people only, like, you know, 2 and 3 and 4,000 years ago were just still, you know, hunter-gatherers wandering around the park is ridiculous. It's nonsense. All right, so let's go on from here. Okay, so just as I said, I'm skipping around the first couple of chapters. I did it in the last one too, but I wanted to read certain things because he's talking about the Ice Age, okay, and you know what he has to say about it. A man has to say about it, okay, and now it's, you know, it could be doubted. All right. Because the sheets of polar ice locked up huge amounts of water, sea levels around the world fell about 300 feet. The shallow Bering Strait became a wide land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. In theory, the Paleo-Indians, as they are called, simply walked across the 55 miles that now separate the continents. C. Vance Haynes, an archaeologist at the University of Arizona, put the crowning touches on this scheme in 1964. This was not the theory of the Ice Age, but the theory of the Bering Crossing, okay? When he noted evidence that just the right time, that is, about 13,000 years ago, 2 great glacial sheets in northwest Canada parted, leaving a comparatively warm, ice-free corridor between them. Down this channel, Paleo-Indians could have passed from Alaska to the more habitable regions in the south without having to hike over the ice pack. At the time, the ice pack extended 2,000 miles south of the Bering Strait and was almost devoid of life. Without Haynes' ice-free corridor, it's hard to imagine how humans could have made it to the south. The combination of a land bridge and ice-free corridor occurred only once in the last 20,000 years and lasted for just a few hundred years. So you see where man says that, okay, in this. So, you know, it seems, you know, just extremely auspicious for all these things to sort of coalesce at once as, you know, what he's trying to say. And it happened just before the emergence of what was then the earliest known culture in the Americas, the Clovis culture, so named for the town in New Mexico where its remains were first definitely observed. Haynes' exposition made the theory seem so ironclad that it barely flew into the textbooks. I learned it when I attended high school. So did my son 30 years later. Okay, and we read about, from C.W. Ceram's books, I went over, you know, Frank C. Hibbins' work of the Sandia man that he found there in Sandia, New Mexico, in the Sandia Mountains there, right by Albuquerque, okay? The remains of somebody who was like 18,000 years old, but they don't include that. They got rid of Hibbins. They didn't like him. So they don't include that, and the man doesn't mention it here, but we know about it, okay? In 1997, the theory abruptly came unglued. Some of its most ardent partisans, Haynes among them, publicly conceded that the archaeological dig in southern Chile had turned up compelling evidence of human habitation more than 12,000 years ago. And because these people lived 7,000 miles south of the Bering Strait, a distance that presumably would have taken a long time to traverse, they almost certainly arrived before the ice-free corridor opened up. Okay? So even the guy who brought the theory around, his mind's changed, okay? But not your average jerk out there who wants to, regurgitate the pablum that he was fed in state-approved, brainwashing academy. Given the near impossibility of surpassing the glaciers without the corridor, some archaeologists suggested that the first Americans must have arrived 20,000 years ago, okay? And that's only because of this, the new research that cast out. But there's been other research, they just don't like it, like Frank C. Hibbins. When the ice pack was smaller, or even earlier than that, at least man has an open mind, the Chilean site has suggestive evidence of artifacts more than 30,000 years old. Okay? And it was like Saran was saying, there's no reason to think that something else won't be found later, or somebody come across something, or some new evidence shows up. But, I believe, because of what Velikovsky said, that the Americans were like wiped clean of the past. Not so much as the rest of the world was. I mean, the rest of the world wasn't as much as the Americans. Okay, the Americans took the real, head-on hit from the interplanetary electrical discharges. Okay. Or perhaps the first Indians traveled by boat and didn't need the land bridge. Or maybe they arrived via Australia, passing the South Pole. Quote, we're in a state of turmoil, unquote, the consulting archaeologist Stuart Theodell told me. Quote, everything we knew is now supposed to be wrong, unquote, he added, exaggerating a little for effect. Okay, so everything they knew is wrong all of a sudden, okay, by all the new research as man is going through in his book here, okay, so all the old ideas that you hear regurgitated by people, and this includes all the research that has to deal with all the people that were ever on these continents here. It's not just narrowly focused on this ancient part of it. It has ramifications for the whole thing. You have to think of it that way. Okay, and everything relates to what's going on here in the Northeast. I'm saying, again, this is like one of the most, under-researched sites all around the world of some ancient stone constructions here that are unbelievable, dolmen and cairns and all this kind of stuff, and it's just like ignored. It's like it doesn't exist, and it's from an important time, and whatever the time whatever the history is, whatever the timeline is, it's an important time that maybe only can be seen through the archaeological evidence here in the Northeast. Okay, so let me go on. This is up into man's chapter, Numbers from Nowhere. And he's describing what the early, the first people to arrive here, when they found the natives here, and describing what they look like. I went over this with Verrazano, and what he says, man goes through some Verrazano stuff. He gets a little bit into it and whatnot, but he doesn't really mention exactly what Verrazano said, and maybe he left it out on purpose. I don't know, but from my video that, Verrazano said that these people were bigger in size, okay, and some of them inclined to a white. For however, racist it is and everything. That's what Verrazano said. He was a racist that lived at that time. So that's what he said. You know, he said some of them inclined to white, you know, as far as the skin color, he was saying, and how beautiful they were. Okay, many Dawnlanders tattooed their faces, arms, and legs with elaborate geometric patterns and totemic animal symbols. They wore jewelry made of shell and swans, down earrings, and chignon spiked with eagle feathers. If that weren't enough, both sexes painted their faces red, white, and black, ending up, Gookin sniffed, with, quote, one part of their face one color and another of another very deformedly. Okay? So, I mean, I don't know about you, but I find this whole way that they mark their faces very interesting, and what the meaning is behind it, and what the history and the origins of that is. I'm just fascinated by that. And many of, you know, markings of the Native Americans, you know, the Native peoples, and throughout all the Americas, just fascinated by how they adorn themselves, you know. And he goes through it, and you know what these people were looking for as far as what they wanted to adorn themselves with. Okay. Many ships anchored off Pawtuxet. Martin Pring, a British trader, camped there with a crew of 44 for 7 weeks in the summer of 1603, gathering sassafras. The species was common in the cleared, burned over areas at the edge of Indian settlements. Okay? The burned over areas at the edge of Indian settlements. Okay? And the reason why I've taken this out, first of all, if you don't know about sassafras, okay, that's where you get sarsaparilla from. You take the root of the sassafras and you boil it. And what you make from that is root beer. I've done it myself. So I'm a pretty good woodsman. I'm not an expert woodsman, but I'm a pretty damn good one and a pretty damn good tracker too. I lived in the wilderness. I lived in the forest. Okay? One-man show in the forest. All right? And if you take the sassafras roots, if you get the sassafras trees, you take the roots and boil them in a pot of water, your whole house smells like root beer. Okay? But back to this burning of the cleared, burned over areas that were adjacent to the Indian settlements. You know, I got into a little bit of a thing. Not really. We're just sort of discussing this stuff with Tim McSweeney from Celebrating the Ceremonial Stone Landscapes. That's the guy I go back and forth with. I post on this Facebook page my videos, and Tim is kind enough to let him get posted there, even though, you know, he doesn't like, you know, large hominids in Atlantis. He doesn't like any of these other things, but whatever, you know, he still doesn't believe that all the stone walls were built by the colonists and settlers, and so many of these things are just effigy walls, storyboard walls, and I'm telling you, it's, you know, this is what, if you don't know about Celebrating the Ceremonial Stone Landscapes of Eastern North America, it's excellent. And here he shows, okay, here's a turtle effigy. Okay, certainly not built by colonists and settlers, okay, but the turtle is, you know, just repeats itself throughout all of this stuff. But, and again, back to my own research, and you know, Tim had said, well, how do I know my turtle in Mallory is a sea turtle? And I said, because of the obvious flipper-shaped stones that they picked. Large one-piece stones, you know, as opposed to this. This is probably your standard, you know, box turtle, painted turtle, snapping turtle, land, you know, terrapins or whatever. Okay, here we got a sea turtle because these things look like flippers. And I go through it in my video here. I'm just going around this thing. There was some rocks in the middle, some stones in the middle, but they don't seem to be there. But this is all bright white. And on the other side, it's even more pronounced. There's an eye carved in there. And you can see the stones picked for the 2 back legs and 2 front. They are all flipper shaped. They're one piece. Not like this. Not like our box turtle. Okay? Which sort of built legs like that. Okay? This is different. And how, it's hardly surprising, and Mann says about it in his work, in his book, see the obvious flipper shape picked here, and a white face like sea turtles have that bright white underside, okay? Flipper, okay? It's a sea turtle, not a terrapin, not a land turtle, all right? And you can see the whale effigy I showed here. Look, here's a whale effigy. All right? And I showed a whale effigy here at Mallory. Okay, it's clear as day. It's a whale effigy. See, his eye, his mouth there, small top, large bottom. All right? But just the head. And sea serpents, serpent walls, etc. that I found at Mallory as well. And people are going to say, well, why, it's a sea, it's not commonplace. Mostly see box turtles and, land turtles, etc., etc. So, I'm just saying that these people had a close association with the sea. They were maritime peoples. They were fishing for herring. All the bounty of the sea was nearby, and a lot of these were coastal, and that's what Mann's talking about, this death and all these colonists moving into these areas and whatnot, because these people were all dead, all right? But they were all on the coastline, okay, and they familiar with the sea, so it's hardly surprising Mallory, which is close to the Housatonic River, that's their maritime roots. And think about the Pleistocene, okay? Think about the megafauna. Think about, okay, have we found every single megafauna that could have existed during the Pleistocene? You think we might not have found one or two that we don't know about, but they found every single one, right? Well, think about that for a second. Think about the ones that they didn't find or don't know about, okay, that are from the Pleistocene megafauna, right? You think they have every single one? I doubt that, all right? There might be a couple missing, and even more so in the sea. So think about that. Think what kind of weird creatures, enormous creatures, were in the sea. Okay, during the Pleistocene. They know about some, okay, but they have no way of knowing about all because they're all down in the sea. Okay, buried under, who knows how many layers of silt. But I just think about that. All right? All right, well, I think, what else did I want to say? I think for right now, that's it. I'm going to go further into this chapter, Numbers from Nowhere. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this because, the native peoples were doing these burns. And actually, Mann goes into it in his book, and he says about how the forest started to encroach upon the land once the native peoples were all killed off, and they weren't practicing their burns, okay, to clear the land there of the fields, I guess, because if you know anything about, the forest there in upstate, there's not a lot of underbrush and stuff, there's some, small stuff here and there, but there's not a lot of underbrush in these kind of forests, okay? Not a lot of stuff that you would have brush fires. Maybe forest fires, but not brush fires. Closer to the coast, and in the open areas, obviously, but in the forest where they retreated to, as it says in Man's book, that was their winter home, away from the shoreline, away from the harsh winds, going into the forests. Okay? So there's not a lot of brush around. And, Timmy from, celebrating Ceremony of Stone Landscape was saying about how they were fire breaks. Well, yeah, that may have been one purpose of them. But when you see the LiDAR map and you see the cockamamie patterns of the stone walls here that don't make any sense whatsoever. I mean, you could say they're fire breaks, I guess, in total or something like that, but this doesn't make any sense as fire breaks either. Okay? It's just wacky patterns all over the place. Or boundary markers, or property lines, or you think that's this right here? This is whacked out. It's not what it is, okay? It's where these people lived in it, in their own sort